Hi and welcome to my studio. Today I'm going to be painting this beautiful forest scene. It's inspired by a screenshot from one of my favourite YouTube channels at the moment. This YouTube channel belongs to the incredibly talented artist Dee Leslie, and it's called the Butterfly Toadstool. And I shall leave a link to the channel below. I'd love you to go over and say hi. There she shares her amazing artwork and pattern making skills, where she creates patterns for all kinds of different products, all based on nature and the incredible environment in which she lives, following the changes in the seasons, the changes in the type of wildlife, plants and fungi that she observes around her. And it's a fantastic channel for anybody that's interested in art and nature. I highly recommend going over there and subscribing. As I say, I'll put the link in the description below, so please pop over and say hello from me. Right, let's get into this wonderful scene. The first thing I'm going to do is show you a very quick time lapse of me sketching the scene out roughly. I'm using a Koh-i-Noor clutch pencil with a 5.6mm lead. This keeps me nice and loose, just focusing on simplifying the scene, getting in all the main shapes of the trees and the lay of the land, just roughly, so that I can use it as a roadmap when I come to paint. You'll notice that I've shaded in some of the darker pine trees, fir trees, because that's going to keep me focused on keeping those nice and dark, because I think that's one of the really important parts in this painting. It's quite a long process to paint this, so I have sped up the footage a little bit for you so it doesn't take too long. And I'm going to be painting wet in wet. So I'm using a large wash brush and wetting the page all over, and then I'll be using the wet in wet method to paint the sky. And you can see I'm using horizontal brush strokes to paint a graduated wash that's darker at the top and lighter at the bottom. Now that's just using Payne's grey, and then I'm putting a bit of Payne's grey into the path across in the foreground and the midground. So everything's still nice and wet, so I'm now going to dip into some perylene green along with the Payne's grey as well, and a bit of sap green to change things up, and then dipping into a bit of burnt sienna as well, just to warm things up too. So I get plenty of variety as I paint in roughly these trees wet in wet. I shall then continue to paint in the sort of mid-tones and lighter values in the rest of the scene using raw sienna, burnt sienna, and the other colours, sap green, perylene green, Payne's grey and some sepia. By quickly painting everything in wet, everything will softly diffuse, it'll dry back a lot lighter, and it will give me a really nice foundation on which to paint some details and darks once it's completely dry. So I'm just going to get all those colours in nice and quickly, keeping it all softly diffused, and then I'll come back and talk a bit more about it when we come to painting wet on dry. I've nearly finished this wet in wet under painting. The foreground is still damp. It's not soaking wet and it's not completely dry. And this is important, and I'm sprinkling ordinary fine table salt into the damp paint, and that hopefully will just give me some texture which should suggest ferns, brambles and undergrowth without me having to paint all the details in. And I hope you notice that I laid my board flat, because now I've finished with the wet in wet painting, I don't want the paint to drift any further down the page. I now need to leave it to dry completely. And here's the dry painting. I've stood it back up to its angle of about 20 degrees because that's where I'm comfortable painting. The first thing I'm going to do is quickly mix up a little bit of cobalt blue and cad red and plenty of water, and I'm just going to carefully put in the distant mountains in the background. I'm using a number 14 round brush with a good point for that, and this paint, as you can see, is very light value, and that will give us some depth and distance as these colours should recede back into the background, as they're a lot cooler than the warmer colours that we're using to paint the foreground with. And now comes the process of painting using the wet on dry method. I should be using a rigger brush for the most part to just use what I call calligraphic brush strokes to sort of scribble in some beautiful darks. So I'm using a much darker value of my greens and reds mixed together, using and trying to get these kind of a variety of hues within this darker tonal value. And as I paint around some of the lighter mid-ground trees, hopefully, and the tree trunks, it'll sort of push this tree line back into the distance and bring the mid-ground and foreground a little bit sort of closer to us as I paint around it. So focusing on the really dark values of these coniferous trees in the background will really help to contrast against the bare branched trees that I'm going to put into the foreground on the left. And these of course are deciduous trees, and they will be bare branched, they've lost their leaves, and as I say, the delicate shapes will hopefully contrast really nicely against the sort of more blocky shaped coniferous trees that are still in full leaf. So I've just painted in some dark shadows in the left foreground going across the tape and painting around some of the little patterns that the salt has given me. And using the rigger brush, I'm going to paint in these beautiful bare branched trees in the foreground. Keeping them nice and simple, I penciled them in at the beginning of the painting and I'm following those lines. You can see how nicely those marks stand out against the sky and how they are in stark contrast with those pine trees in the background. The paint that I'm using for this is Payne's grey, but I've mixed in some of the green, the perylene green, into it and a bit of the burnt sienna, so I get a sort of real brownish black rather than a jet black, and that just gives a little added character to these trees. I'm making sure that I take the pressure off my rigger brush and sort of flick it off at the end of my brush strokes for the finer branches towards the top of the tree. So here now is my favourite moment, removing the tape and seeing the painting with a clean white border, and lets us see it with fresh eyes, makes us see it as if it's finished, almost as if it's in a mount and a frame. And I'm really pleased with the way the painting has turned out. This is my first try at a complex forest demo like this, and I'm really pleased with the way it's turned out. It's not perfect, but I think it's a really good starting point to then begin to work on and refine the process. So hopefully there'll be more of these sort of atmospheric scenes coming up this year as I practice painting this style of woodland. And thank you so much to Dee from the Butterfly and Toadstool. Don't forget to follow the link below and maybe consider subscribing to her channel. Not only will you see some incredible artwork being produced, you will also be treated to some wonderful walks out in the gorgeous countryside of Scotland. So I hope you found this painting useful, starting off with a rough sketch and then really focusing on the tonal values in order to build up the layers of this painting and also to make a stark contrast between the coniferous woodland and the deciduous trees in the foreground. Well, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, then please give us a thumbs up and maybe consider subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. It costs nothing. And if you click on the bell icon, you'll be notified whenever we post a new demo. Well, many thanks, and many thanks as well to our amazing patrons who follow us on Patreon and support the channel. If you're interested in supporting the channel, then follow either of the links below. I'll see you again soon and have a lovely weekend.